You don't know me. This was the church where I first started doing youth work here in Suffolk a long, long time ago. And those of you that are still here, you're probably amazed that I'm still alive, and even more amazed that your young people are still alive. So this is a place that I've got really warm affection for as a church. And at the moment, I work for the Anglican Church in Suffolk. You know, those old stone buildings in every village that you come across. And I describe the Anglican Church as this beautiful, faith-filled, very strange organisation. And my job is to help them think about young people in what they do, in how they set up their services. And I think we're beginning to see some green shoots of change here within Suffolk. And it's a real privilege to do that job, I think. And it's actually a privilege to stand here on Mothering Sunday as a male and as somebody who's clearly not a mother. I hope by the end of this, you, particularly women out there, you'll feel that I've done justice to this sort of subject. And of course, whenever it comes to Mothering Sunday, we can't help but think about our own mums, can we? None of you will know my mum, but she's can't live with her out her kind of woman. She's fantastic. When my parents divorced when I was a teenager, she had to raise 4 children on her own, 3 sons who were pretty much like me. And she did an amazing job, didn't she? Yes, you see. She did all right, my mum. Although there are some situations that I look back and I go, Mum, what made you do that? And one of them that comes to mind was when I was about 11 years old and it was tea time. My mum dropped a bottle of tomato sauce on my foot accidentally. It broke and it cut my foot open. And I clearly remember her looking at the clock and going, oh, accident and emergency will be busy now. Go and get the sewing kit. And I had to hop, get the sewing kit, and my mum sewed my foot up on the kitchen table and then made me do the rest of the preparation for tea. And I still look back 40 years later and, Mum, you were a nurse. Surely you know that wasn't the best thing to do. But anyway, I'm still here and I'm still alive, which is good. And of course, we can all, even if we're male, we can all look and sort of imagine the joy of being a mother when baby is asleep. We can even turn to the back of the church, and there's a couple there at the back of church. And we can imagine the joy when babies are asleep, and they're beautiful, and it's serene, and the house is clean and tidy, and the dinner's in the oven. And we can imagine that's what it's going to be like. But of course, the reality is babies are crying and screaming. The house looks like a bomb's hit it. You find yourself having to be in 3 places at once. You feel like a taxi driver. Is this correct, women? Yeah, for some of them, there's some nods. Dinner is nowhere even being thought about. And the truth is that at times, our children make us so mad, we just want to throttle them. Although we'd never admit it because we're 2 good Christians. I wonder if even Mary, on those odd occasions, picked up baby Jesus and handed him to Joseph and said, you deal with him because I don't know what I'll do to him. Maybe that happened. And maybe, as all parents, there are those moments we stare into their eyes as babies or as young children, and we wonder what they'll grow into. We wonder what personality will arise within them. We wonder what job they'll end up doing. We wonder if they'll grow up happy and healthy. And you can imagine that as young children, and then they get to teenage years, and you can't get them out of bed before lunchtime. And there's sort of a grunting reply to any question you ask, if they can get their head out of their phone. And you wonder if communication will ever come back. And it does. Don't worry, it does. And when we look in the Bible, if you think that there is no women of influence and leadership in the Bible, then you have missed something crucial in the story of God. I want to tell you that. You think through, you think of the book of Judges, and you think of Deborah, this fantastic leader that God rose because there weren't any suitable men around. You think of Exodus and the worship leading Miriam within the Exodus story. You think of the reformers and Huldah, the prophetess, and you think of Queen Esther and Mary Magdalene, the first person to witness the resurrected Christ. You think of Lydia and Phoebe and Priscilla and countless more who are unnamed because they recognize the story isn't about them, but it's about their God. And even if you focus in on mothers in the Bible, those mothers who look at their children and wonder what they might grow into, think of Mary, holding Jesus with all the strange events that happened around the Christmas story. And then for the next 30 years, it was fairly mundane. Did she ever look at her child and think, did I get it wrong? Was the story not really about him? Think of Rebecca, the mother of these twins, Esau and Jacob, these wrestling, fighting twins who grow up selling their birthright for a bowl of stew, wanting instant gratification of their inheritance. Maybe some of you parents look at your children and think, that's true for them now. They want it all right now. Think of Jehoshaphat, perhaps the most underrated mother in the whole Bible, the mother of Moses. Imagine picking up your baby for one last time before you put them afloat in the river, trusting them into God's hands. For those of you that know your Bible, you know what wouldn't have occurred if she'd not had that faith. Think of Hannah, this woman, years and years, decades, being unable to conceive a child and having to cope with watching her husband and her husband's other wife taunt her for being childless. And some of you will know that feeling inside of desperately wanting to be a mother, and it's not come true for you yet. Even think of Bathsheba, this mistress of David, who bore the son Solomon, the wisest man that's ever lived. And she's one of only 5 women listed in the line of the Messiah. So if you're sitting here this morning and your mothering starts from a place that you never dreamt it would, take heart. Because God can still use you and your children. And in many ways, I'm tempted just to stop there and sit down, but you might feel like you've been cheated, so I'll keep going. Imagine being the mum of some of the people in the Bible. And imagine being the mum to this character Samson, which we're going to look at this morning. Imagine being the parent to a strong-willed child. Some of you don't have to imagine this. You've got it. But imagine being a mum of a strong-willed child. For Samson, it would be like trying to be Ma and Pa Kent of Superman, How do you raise and discipline a kind of a super child? And we don't really know what Samson looked like. He might have just looked like an ordinary kid who, for some reason, a supernatural strength came on him at times. Or he might have looked like Superman. We don't know. But this was a child who God had marked out. And we're going to look at him in just a moment. But just to set the scene a little bit with something a little bit crazy. Do you ever look at your children as parents? Do you ever look at them and go, I wonder where they got that from? You look at what they do or what they say or how they sit or how they run, and you think, I wonder how they got... And then you look at their husband, your husband, or their father, or or your grandparents, and you go, I can see it now. I can see it. Even things that you think that cannot possibly be genetic, but somehow it seems to have been passed down the line. There's this amazing website I've discovered, okay? If you're ever bored at work, not that you ever are, but if you're ever bored at work and want something to while away the time, take a look at this website. I think it's going to come up here. tylervigan.com. It sounds really boring, but it is a website full of spurious correlations, okay? And so we're going to take a look at a few of them. So the red line is the number of people who drowned by falling into a pool. And the black is the films that Nicolas Cage has appeared in. They're so close, they must have a correlation, right? You're not convinced, are you? Anyone convinced? There's 30,000 of these on the site, by the way, if you're interested. What about the next one? Divorce rate in Maine and per capita consumption of margarine. Okay? It's almost exactly the same. And I tell you what, my mum was one of those mums who only bought margarine because it was cheaper than butter. She should know how close she came. No, maybe it was the reason my dad left. No, that's not. Anyway, per capita cheese consumption with the number of people who die by becoming tangled in their bedclothes. Look how close that is. Some of you are thinking, why on earth is he showing this in church? It is amazing when you look at correlations and you think, wow. Now, of course, being serious, the data seems to show a direct correlation. But of course, we're just playing with data, aren't we? You know, cheese probably doesn't cause death by entanglement in bedsheets. Or does it? You'll think about that next time you have cheese before you go to bed, won't you? Now, of course, there are also some things in our life which are some known correlations. You talk to any doctor, any nutritionist. You know, if you eat McDonald's every day, if you drink pints of Coke, if you don't exercise, the graph of gaining weight and food consumption will probably be very similar. That's just life. There's some true things about life. But actually, there are some truisms when it comes to parenting. Whether you're parenting an unknown child or whether you're parenting a Samson. You know, if we wanted to learn about living in faith, we'd want to spend a day with Abraham or Isaac or Jacob, wouldn't we? If you want to run faster, you'd spend a day with Usain Bolt. If you want to write a great story, you'd spend a day with J.K. Rowling. If you want to know about parenting, try spending a day in the shoes of Samson's parents. Because if you know anything about the story of Samson, you know that for most of his life, he didn't operate as a hero of faith at all. He was selfish, he was arrogant, he was a bit of a player when it came to the ladies, and that was the downfall of his life, of his faith, and of his family. So what can we possibly learn from him and his parents on Mothering Sunday? Well, perhaps more than we might think. And the first thing could be this. Obviously, Samson had two parents, right? Manoah, his dad, and his mum. Anyone know the name? I'd be surprised if you did, because it's not mentioned in the Bible. And maybe that's the first thing we learn. Because we all want to be recognised, don't we? We all want to be recognised for what we do and what we achieve. Certainly, mums, and I get it. But on this Mothering Sunday, the mum is unnamed. And you might feel that what you do goes unnoticed. You might feel that all you're doing, in inverted commas, is sitting at home, cleaning the house, looking after the kids, picking them up after school, doing the cleaning, getting dinner ready. You might feel that's all you're doing. But this is your story here, right now. You might feel like you're working your fingers to the bone and they can't even be bothered to remember your name, right? So in this story, in the Bible, in this book of Judges, this is a time in Israel's history where God is raising up individual leaders, both men and women, individual leaders to push Israel on to the next stage of their walk with him. Normally, these leaders are given a specific task to accomplish, an army to defeat, or something like that. And one day, a man of God, I think it's going to come up, thank you, a man of God appears to Manoah's wife. This man of God is an angel and says, you're going to conceive and you're going to have a son. She's really shocked at this point because she's childless and she thinks she's not going to have a child. She thinks there's no hope of her falling pregnant. And it says, you're going to have a son whose head is never to be touched by a razor because the boy is to be a Nazarite dedicated to God from the womb. And he'll take the lead in delivering Israel from the hands of the Philistines. And broadly speaking, the angel was calling her and the son to a simplified version of the Nazarite vow. Now, if you're interested in the full version, you can read it in Numbers chapter 6. But essentially, this is a vow, it's a calling to live your life differently from the people around you. To look different, to act different, because God has got something special in store for you. And God was asking Manoah and the unnamed mum to raise Samson in a specific way, because he'd got a specific task for him. You see, before birth, she had this weight on her shoulder as a mum, didn't she? I've got to raise this boy because he's destined to deliver Israel. And if you know the story, Samson did take on this vow initially. Well, mum and dad took it on for him. And in fact, the parents modelled this vow. They lived out the same vow. But things began to go wrong when it hit teenage years. Now, I shouldn't be the person up here offering parental advice. I know it's a bit ridiculous. I haven't got children of my own. But in my years of youth work, there's a couple of things that I want to share from what I've observed. Take it or leave it. The first thing is, model the faith that you want your family to have. I think that's going to come up. Model the faith you want your family to have. Parents out there, if you want your children to follow in your footsteps, model it. It's quite simple in that respect. This unnamed, seemingly unimportant mum had a direct mission to model what faith looked like for her child, even more so than dad. I don't know if it's a correlation graph, whether it would fit on Tyler Vigan, but I suspect it would do. But this one would be true. In a world that seems to be pushing women to be career women, we somehow have lost the immense calling it is to be a mum. And in those precious early years of child raising, mum's influence is high. Psychologists tell us that actually, as kids enter teenage years, the influence actually is shifted more onto the father. But in childhood, the mum's influence is really, really important. Perhaps more important than you realise. So model the faith you want your child to have. The angel gave Samson's mum this clear prophecy with clear instructions and actually appeared to the mum first, which is kind of unusual itself. You know, in the Bible, you'd expect them to come to dad first, right? No. Came to mum first, and actually, dad, when you read the story, dad had a few doubts. He started arguing with the angel. But no, mum just kind of accepted it. Sometimes God allows mum into things before he does the dad. And perhaps that's because there's an understanding of the pivotal role that mums play in early development. Your son is to be set apart for God. And actually that's what we've all been called to. That's what the word holy means, in case you didn't know. The word holy simply means to be set apart. Now, we're not all called to be Nazarites. We can have our hair how we like, largely speaking. We can have a drink occasionally. But the deeper truth still holds. Are we as family set apart for God? When you think of your child raising, your parenting, are you set apart as a family for God? How different are you and your family as people of faith? Or are you basically the same as your neighbour next door, except you disappear on a Sunday morning at 10:15 and get back at midday, slightly better dressed than everyone else? Or are you really set apart as your family? What decisions and choices and actions do you make as a family which set you apart as a people of God? Because I know this, your children are watching. Your children are watching you, mum and dad, and they're watching the choices and decisions that you make for your family. And is God a part of that decision making? You know, and perhaps this is where I come in as a youth worker, and I know it's weird to have me giving some parenting advice. But I do hear some of the stories. That's a joke. You're all looking very serious here today. But are we modelling the kind of faith that we want our children to exhibit? Does prayer and Bible reading feature in your family's week? Does it have priority in who you are? When you talk or when you discuss life, does God feature in it? Do you share stories of faith and unanswered prayer as well as answered prayer? Do you have times of, hey, I'm sorry, to your children, so that they see what it looks like to ask for forgiveness? Do they see how your family budget is spent and how much God features in that? If you want your child to have an exciting, passionate faith, do they see you as a family modelling an exciting, passionate faith? Do they see you with a passion for mission or for homelessness or for 101 different issues around our world? If you want your children to know the importance of giving to the church, do they see how you model that? Do you see raising your child in faith as your responsibility? Or do we just delegate it to Alice and Hannah and Emma and the youth and children's teams? The truth is, they'll have 2 hours a week with your kids tops, and you have much more in which to influence. And I know all of what I've said is really tough. It's easy to say and so much harder to live out, right? Some of you are wanting to throw stuff at me right now. Go, Matt, you don't know how tough it is. Matt, that's so unrealistic. And some of you will be trying to parent children that aren't yours. And it suddenly becomes doubly hard. Or you're trying to parent where you as mum and dad aren't even on the same page when it comes to faith. And that becomes trebly hard. But are we at least aiming at modelling a faith that we want our children to follow? You see, for Samson's mum and dad, it cost them. It actually cost them, literally. They had to sacrifice animals. They had to sacrifice their finances, their giving, towards this vow that they'd made for God. And soon they were on the same page, working in tandem to bring up Samson. And of course, we don't know the exact age of Samson in this story as the Bible begins to get interested in it. But it seems to be sort of teenage years, late teenage years, that Samson seems to go off the rails. And again, some of you know that feeling in your heart as I speak. Because you know your children have perhaps decided to take a different path than you would have wanted. There's the bit in the story, I probably haven't got it up there. There's a bit in the story where Samson turns to his mum and dad and says, basically, I like that woman, go and get her for me. I know what would happen to me if I'd said that to my mum. I'd have got a good clip round the ear. You know, we can see that he's becoming this sort of arrogant, I know it all sort of teenager. And the other bit of parenting advice, if I could give that, is that there comes a time when your faith as parents has to be taken on and owned by your child. You know, this isn't to denigrate the fantastic work of children's workers like Emma, but largely speaking, children follow the faith of their parents. But when they move into youth, into teenage years, they begin to think differently. They begin to stop living off their parents' faith, and they start thinking through, is this a faith I want to live out for myself? And that's a good thing, right? We want them to own that faith for themselves. And as a child's brain develops and moves into teenage years, something happens in there. They begin to develop a sense of self in a way that they never had as children. They begin to question and challenge and doubt. And isn't that hard for us of Bible-believing Christian parents when we see our children begin to doubt? And that's why I love being a youth worker, because I get to sit with them and talk with them about those doubting times. But they're in a process of beginning to own the faith for themselves. And that has to be done. We cannot live, and I say that to all of us, adults as well, we cannot live off the faith of other people. The Christian faith actually is a solo one. It's a relationship between me and God lived out in the community that we call the church. But initially it's a private solo one between me and God. And then I live it out in the company of others who have got that solo walk. And it's so hard for us as parents of faith because we desperately want our children to follow Jesus as we do. But we have to recognise it has to be owned by them. And some of them will choose to walk away and become prodigals. Godly parents do not always produce godly children. Samson was brought up in faith by faithful parents who modelled it, who kept the vows, who lived the holy lives, and yet still he walked away from God. And he broke every single one of the Nazirite vows. He pushed the boundaries to begin with. I'll just walk in the vineyards, but I won't drink. And again, you've probably seen that in your teenage children, right? I'll just push the boundaries a little bit. And then more and more until he stepped over it. And he drank and he touched dead bodies. He married outside the tribe. He slept with prostitutes. He skipped out on a wedding and got offered the younger sister instead. And of course, famously, he got his hair, or allowed his hair to be cut. And some of those things he did willingly and consciously, knowing that they were sins. But before we judge him too harshly, isn't that the story of our lives too? I know in my life, there are times where I choose the wrong thing deliberately. I often say when I'm preaching in churches, if you knew what went on in here, you probably wouldn't ask me to preach. But then again, if I knew what was going on in your heads, you probably wouldn't want to be here either. And there are times where God led Samson majestically. But there was always a sense that it was Samson's gifting and not God's gifting until the very end. Imagine what that felt like as a parent. Imagine what it feels like And some of you won't have to imagine too hard to see your son skip slowly away and make choices that deep down you know are wrong. And to metaphorically even stick two fingers up at God. Because Samson didn't care at that point. His parents knew that every choice he was making was bad news for his son. But he still had to, just going back to the previous slide, he still had to own the faith for himself. You see, the thing is with stats and correlation graphs and optimistic, unrealistic pronouncements on parenting from a non-father on stage, is that you can do it all right and still not get the results you want. Because sometimes it doesn't work. Because we're dealing with people with free will. And actions lead us to places. And if a child walks away from faith, it's easy to blame ourselves. And of course we have to look at our own choices. But sooner or later, our young people take the responsibility of faith themselves. And the hardest thing we can do as parents is to let them go. Now, we don't know enough about the intricate day-to-day parenting skills of Mr. and Mrs. Sampson, but it seems like they really tried. Their sweet, lovely child grew into an arrogant, self-righteous, indulgent, late teens, early 20s. And some of you know that. And you tried your best, however flawed your best is, and your son or daughter has walked away. And we know this term, prodigals. If you don't know it, it's a term that comes from a story that Jesus told of a son who wanted his father's inheritance now, in effect wishing his father was dead. And the son took the money and ran and did stuff with it that no good Jewish boy should ever do. And the dad stayed watching and waiting, hoping and loving, desperate for one day his son to appear on the horizon. And it's a parable, it's a story about God's relationship with every single one of us. And sometimes we do need to say, God, I messed up and I didn't get it right as a parent. But sometimes we also have to recognise that it's not our fault. As I begin to close, for Samson's parents, the prodigal didn't come home, at least not to them, but he did return home to his heavenly Father. At the end of the story, Samson is found alone. He's scared, he's humiliated, and at the end of the story, there's no sign of the arrogance that once sort of betrayed his character. And at the end of the story, he finally prays and submits to God, perhaps for the first time, and in his death accomplished his calling. And sometimes prodigals come home and there is feasting and there is joy and there is celebration. And sometimes they don't. And so my third bit of advice is don't give up hope. If you're one of those parents, don't give up hope. Keep on loving, hold on in faith, and be prepared to run out and greet them when they come home. Whether you're a mother here today or a father, keep hoping, keep praying, and leave the light on, calling them home. Home to your house and your family, and home to God. And in some respects, that's not the end of what I want to say, but it is a pause. Because in a moment, we're going to come on to a time of communion. And I want that communion to be a continuation. Because I'm going to ask the worship band to come up and get ready as we prepare for a time of communion. But it's worth remembering in communion that God, the perfect Father, has trouble with his children too. And that's you and I. And he's calling for some of us to come home. And we are prodigals that he wants to come home. I'll share a little bit more about that in a moment. We're going to sing a song of worship together, which talks about the goodness